referred to something he calls the death tax, which is what we call the estate tax, which was developed by President Teddy Roosevelt way back when. What he forgot to mention is that this estate tax, and as I understand it, the senator from Arizona, if he had all of his wish fulfilled, would repeal the estate tax completely. It benefits only the wealthiest 0.3% of the population. So all of the concerns about the onerous impact of the estate tax, it benefits 0.3%. 99.7% of the families will not benefit at all from the repeal of the estate tax. And the second point is, if the estate tax were completely repealed, Mr. Chairman, the estimate is that over a 20-year period, it would add about $1 trillion to our debt, $1 trillion, which, like the war in Iraq, is simply not paid for. So when people talk about fiscal responsibility, I find it a little bit hard to understand how they could dump another $1 trillion into our national debt, which benefits only the top 0.3% of the population, which means that we'll be the middle class and working families obliged to have to pay that off over many years. So I think sometimes when our friends on the Republican side talk about fiscal responsibility, I'm not quite sure where they are coming from. Mr. President, I thank you, by the way, for sitting in for me, and I'll, as soon as I finish, be up there to take the chair. But I did want to say that a budget, and the budget that we are debating right now on the floor of the United States Senate, is not just numbers. What a budget is about are the values of our country and are the priorities of our country. And within that context, it's important to understand what, in fact, is going on in America right now. And the simple reality is that the middle class is collapsing. Everybody who gets into their car in the morning and pays $3.20 for a gallon of gas, goes to work and finds that they're paying a lot more for their health insurance than they used to, understands they don't have a pension where one time they were promised a pension, understands that over 8 million Americans since Bush has been president have lost their health insurance. The middle class is in collapse. Wages are going down for tens of millions of Americans. During the Bush administration, private sector job growth has averaged less than 50,000 per month, compared with over 220,000 under the Clinton administration. Since President Bush has been in office, from 2001, nearly 5 million more Americans slipped into poverty. Median household income for working-age families down by $2,500. 8.5 million Americans lost their health insurance. 3 million lost their pensions. The annual trade deficit has more than doubled, and over 3 million good-paying manufacturing jobs have been lost. The price of gas at the pump and home heating oil has more than doubled, while ExxonMobil made $40 billion in profits last year, more than any company in the history of the world. The personal savings rate recently dipped below zero, something that hasn't happened since the Great Depression, and home foreclosures, of course, are now the highest on record, turning the American dream of home ownership into an American nightmare for millions. The reason that I raise these issues is because it is important to put the debate over the budget in a general context. This is not some abstraction. This is not some academic exercise. What we're talking about are the priorities of the American people within the context of what is really happening to the middle class and working families. And added to that, I found it interesting that my good friend from Arizona talked about the European Union, tried to compare the United States in terms of tax policy to other countries. Well, let me also compare the United States to some other countries. Today, the United States has the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth. We have the highest infant mortality rate of any major country on earth. We have the highest overall poverty rate of any major country on earth. We have the largest gap between the rich and the poor, the most people behind bars, and we are the only country in the industrialized world not to have a national health care program. Now, I wonder if my friends who get up here and talk about the European Union might on occasion mention the kind of health care systems that exist in every single one of those countries which guarantee health care to all of their people. Try to describe the types of parental leave programs that exist when families have a baby. Americans could not understand the extent to which those countries are so far ahead of us in terms of family values. So while the middle class in this country declines, while poverty increases, while we have the highest infant mortality rate of any other country, while 17,000 Americans die because they don't have any health insurance, there is another reality in American society today, a reality that we should also be talking about here. And that is, Mr. President, that the wealthiest people in this country have never had it so good since the 1920s. According to Forbes magazine, the collective net worth of the wealthiest 400 Americans increased by $290 billion last year. 400 families, $290 billion increase last year to $1.54 trillion. In addition, the top 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. You know, sometimes my Republican friends talk about averages and so forth. That's not the reality here. If you look at the American economy like one would look at a football game or a baseball game, the important question to ask is who is winning, who is losing? Well, let me be very clear. The middle class is losing. Working families are losing. The people on top have never had it so good since the 1920s. They are winning, and they are winning big time. And to ignore that reality is to ignore what is happening in American society. The question then becomes, given that reality, where do we go from there? Where do we go from there? What we do know is the President has given us his answer. The President has brought forth a budget. He has told us that in his budget, we don't have enough money to meet the health care needs of this country. So at a time when our health care system is disintegrating, the President has decided that we cannot adequately fund the Children's Health Insurance Program and that we should cut Medicare and Medicaid by more than $600 billion over the next decade. Think about it. Healthcare system disintegrating, more and more people uninsured, more and more people higher deductibles and co-payments. The President's response, let's make a terrible situation even worse. The President has said in his budget that we need to reduce the number of children receiving child care by 200,000 kids. Any mother, any parent understands that our current child care situation in America today is an absolute disaster. We say to single moms, go out and work, but we forget to ask, what are those moms supposed to do with their 2-year-olds or their 3-year-olds? Should we leave them home alone in the apartment, or should we provide quality child care for them? Well, in Vermont and all over this country, it is increasingly difficult for families to secure quality, affordable child care, and the President's brilliant response is let's cut the number of children receiving child care assistance by 200,000. My friend from Arizona said, are there some people who want to spend more money? And I said, yeah, I do. I do not want the children in this country to have the dubious distinction of having the highest rate of poverty of any major country on earth. And I would hope that every member of the Senate would be deeply humiliated and embarrassed about that reality taking place within this country. There is a housing crisis all over America, in Vermont, all over America. And I'm not just talking about foreclosures. I'm talking about the needs of working families to find safe and affordable housing. President's response in the middle of this crisis, let's provide 100,000 fewer Section 8 housing vouchers to low-income families. The President, in his budget, has said not enough money for special education. We made a promise to school districts all over America decades ago. We said if you mainstream kids, which I think is a great idea, we will pick up the very high cost of special education. That was the promise. And today in Vermont, all over America, More and more kids are coming in with special ed needs. School districts are paying outrageously high property taxes to accommodate those kids. I think it is time to keep the promise that we made to school districts and adequately fund special education. Yeah, I think we should do that. I think we should adequately fund Head Start so that all the families in America want their kids to get a decent start so that they're not behind when they enter the first grade. Have that opportunity. But somehow, in the midst of not funding the needs of our kids, not funding housing, not funding LIHEAP, not funding virtually every need of low and middle income families, well, the president does have some money available. If you are rich, the president has money available for you. The president believes that we have enough money to provide $812 billion in tax cuts for households earning more than $1 million per year over the next decades. Not for our children, not for the homeless, not for the hungry, but for people who are earning over $1 million a year. That is an absurd and obscene sense of priorities. Fortunately, while the budget resolution we will be debating this week is not perfect, it is a vast improvement over the president's budget, and I want to thank the presiding officer, Senator Conrad, for his hard work in giving us that budget. Instead of cutting back on the educational needs of this country, this budget resolution provides $5.4 billion more than the president's request for education, including the largest increase for elementary and secondary education programs since 2002. Instead of cutting back on the needs of our veterans, which has long been the history of the Bush administration, this budget resolution provides $3.2 billion increase over the president's budget for our veterans. Instead of ignoring the urgent need to reduce our dependence on foreign oil and fossil fuels, this budget resolution provides $8.45 billion to invest in clean energy, create millions of good-paying green-collar jobs, and energy efficiency. Instead of cutting back on our nation's enormous infrastructure needs, can you imagine the engineers, civil engineers tell us we have over $1 trillion in unmet infrastructure needs, and this White House is refusing to even acknowledge the severity of the program, is asking the cities and towns who are hard-pressed to come up with the money. This budget resolution provides almost $9 billion more than the president for our roads, bridges, highways, sewers, and clean water improvements. Not enough, but it is a step forward. But, Mr. President, I think that over the long term, we can do even better than that. We've made progress. In this budget, we can do better. One area that I'll be paying particular attention to is our children. Mr. President, it is not acceptable to me, as I said earlier, that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty among our children. Where are all of those people who keep talking about family values and family values? How do they continue to ignore the reality that by far we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country? Nearly 1 out of every 5 children in this country lives in poverty. That ain't a family value. That is a national disgrace. Now, what happens to these kids when they become adults? Well, many of them will do well, but many of them will not. You may have seen, Mr. President, recently an article in the papers talking about the fact that the United States has more people behind bars at great expense for states, for the federal government, than any other country, more than China in total numbers. I happen to believe that there is a correlation between the fact that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty, where kids, drop off the wagon when they are young, they drop out of society, they do drugs, they do destructive activity, they end up in jail. We spend $50,000 a year keeping them in jail rather than providing the child care and the educational opportunities that we need. Mr. President, in my opinion, there are 3 major trends in American society that we should be addressing in this budget process. First, the fact that the United States has the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country, and the gap between the very, very rich and everyone else is growing wider. Second, as I mentioned earlier, that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty. And third, and I know the presiding officer has made this point over and over and over again, that we have a $9.2 trillion national debt, which is soaring to $10 trillion, that under the Bush administration we've seen a $3 trillion increase in the national debt. This is a debt that is unsustainable economically. It is a debt that is immoral because we're simply piling it up and leaving it to our kids and our grandchildren. And I think those are some of the trends in American society that we should be dealing with in this budget. Mr. President, this week I will be offering an amendment which is being co-sponsored by Senators Durbin, Mikulski, and Boxer, which is a very simple amendment. It doesn't go as far as I personally would like to go, but it is a step forward, perhaps in changing the nature of the debate that we have here on the floor of the Senate. It puts the needs of our kids, working families, persons with disabilities, and senior citizens on fixed incomes ahead of the wealthy few. That's what it does. Specifically, this amendment would restore the top income tax bracket to 39.6% for households earning more than $1 million per year. That's all, the only group of people impacted, households earning more than $1 million a year. That is 0.3% of our population. And we would use that revenue to begin to address the most urgent, unmet needs of our kids, dealing with job creation and deficit reduction. According to the Joint Tax Committee, restoring the top income tax bracket for people making more than $1 million to what it was in 2000 before the Bush tax breaks for the wealthy would increase revenue by $32.5 billion over the next 3 years, including $10.8 billion in fiscal year 2000 alone. But we have a choice. We have a choice as a Senate. We can give $32.5 billion to the top 0.3%, people making at least $1 million a year, including billionaires. That's one thing we could do. Or else we can do something else with this money. And let me suggest that we should do something else. Let me suggest that at a time when all of the presidential candidates are talking about change, 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 when the American people want to move our country in a new direction, that maybe the Senate can begin that journey of taking this nation in a new way, which is more equitable, it is more fair, and it begins to address longstanding social needs. So here's the option: $32.5 billion more in tax relief for millionaires and billionaires. One option. I suspect many of our friends on the Republican side think that's a great idea. Or there is another option. Let me suggest the other option: $10 billion over a 3-year period to go into the program of special ed. This will not only allow school districts the opportunity to better educate kids with special ed needs, it will also lower property taxes and local taxes, and most importantly, it will keep the promise made to school districts all over this country. The federal government made a promise that it would fund 40% of the cost of special ed. Unfortunately, today we're about at 17%. You want to raise credibility? Let's keep the promise we made to school districts all over America. Let's take care of some of our most vulnerable kids. $10 billion goes to that. Then this amendment would also increase Head Start by $5 billion over the next 3 years. Every study indicates that Head Start works. It gives kids who otherwise don't have the intellectual and emotional environment the chance to do well when they get to school. It is a good investment. Better investing $5 billion in Head Start than $5 billion in jails. This amendment would put $5 billion into Head Start. This amendment would provide $4 billion increase for the Child Care Development Block Grant Program so that working families all over this country would have a fair shot at trying to find affordable child care. This amendment puts $3.5 billion increase into the food stamp program. In my view, hunger in America is not something that we should be about. This will take us a small step toward addressing hunger. This program would also put $4 billion into the LIHEAP program, because nobody in the United States of America should go cold in the winter or die of heat exposure when the weather gets 120 and you don't have an air conditioner. This amendment would also provide $3 billion for school construction, create good-paying jobs in the process, and make sure that our kids have good schools in which to learn. And also, Mr. President, this amendment would reduce the deficit by $3 billion. So that's what we do. We reduce the deficit, we protect our children, we protect the most vulnerable people. That's one option. Or we give another $32 billion in tax relief to people who don't need it. I think the choice is pretty clear, and I hope this amendment will receive widespread support. And with that,